Okay, let's dive right into today's explainer. We're unpacking a highly partisan, widely discussed editorial about the unprecedented May 19th impeachment vote against Taiwan's president Lai Ching-te. We're going to keep a strictly neutral lens here, mapping out exactly how the author builds their argument. It's really about seeing what this text reveals about the current political climate, right on the eve of the president's 2-year anniversary. Now, the editorial immediately throws this fascinating political mystery right at us. Why on earth would the opposition, specifically the blue and white camps, launch such an extreme measure when they mathematically know it's destined to fail? I mean, it seems completely counterintuitive, right? But the author argues there's actually a much deeper historical strategy at play here. Let's look at Section 1, a historic constitutional moment. The author really sets the stage by making it crystal clear that this isn't just another standard political maneuver or your everyday partisan squabble. No, this is the very first presidential impeachment vote in the constitutional history of the Republic of China. So the editorial argues we are at a critical, historic juncture for Taiwan's democratic constitutionalism. It's a moment that touches the very core of how power is checked and balanced. Which brings us to Section 2, the modern Don Quixote. To really understand the author's framing here, we have to look closely at the constitutional math involved. The first major barrier, it requires exactly 1/2 of all legislators just to officially propose the impeachment action. Think about that. That is a massive hurdle just to get the paperwork on the table and officially kick off the whole process. And it turns out the hurdle only grows from there. Once it's actually proposed, it requires a massive 2/3 majority of all legislators to pass the resolution and send it over to the Constitutional Court for a ruling. In the current divided political reality, where the ruling party holds a significant number of seats, well, reaching that 2/3 threshold is essentially impossible for the opposition. Because of these towering, honestly nearly impossible thresholds, the editorial likens the opposition politicians to a famous fictional knight. They characterize the whole effort as a modern version of Don Quixote. So the author isn't framing this as some practical political calculation. Instead, they paint it as a noble, principle-driven quest. It's like knights charging at insurmountable odds, fully aware their lance is going to break against the windmill, but doing it anyway out of a sense of duty. Let's check out Section 3, Accusations of Overreach. So what exactly are they so angry about that they trigger this historic mechanism in the first place? Well, according to the editorial, the opposition has compiled a hefty list of complaints they're calling the 12 sins. These grievances include accusations that the president is refusing to countersign, execute, or publish past bills, and that he's actively ignoring legislative reviews. But it goes even further. They accuse the administration of using populist tactics, like summoning the Bluebird protesters to pressure lawmakers and initiating massive recall campaigns to overturn democratic results. Now, what is really fascinating here is the deep institutional clash the text highlights. On one side, you have the legislature, which the author firmly asserts is the highest representative body of the people, demanding accountability. But on the other side, the presidential office argues that any process to impeach the president belongs strictly under the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, not direct political scrutiny by the legislature. The source actually notes that the president's office has repeatedly refused to attend these sessions, effectively leaving the legislature's official correspondence on read. And wow, the author uses incredibly strong language to describe this standoff. The editorial accuses the executive branch of, quote, using administrative dictatorship to bypass legislative power. The core argument here is that by refusing to engage with the opposition-controlled legislature and trying to essentially castrate the parliament's oversight abilities, the administration is threatening to cast a shadow of a new authoritarianism over Taiwan's democracy. The author claims the executive power is publicly bullying the legislative power. Moving on to Section 4, Tale of Three Presidents. To really drive this point about authoritarianism home, the editorial tries to prove this shift by contrasting President Lai's leadership style with his two immediate predecessors from his own party. The author points out that former President Chen Shui-bian operated on a trilogy of conflict, compromise, and progress. Then, former President Tsai Ing-wen famously began her term with the mantra, humility, humility, humility. But, according to the author, the current administration has totally abandoned those traits, labeling President Lai's style as simply conflict, 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 and arrogance, arrogance, arrogance. The text goes so far as to accuse the president of having a fighting cock personality and an attitude of, and this is a direct quote from the source, stubbornness in choosing evil. That's heavy stuff. The editorial argues that this specific, unyielding, domineering style of governance is exactly what's tearing the country apart,
polarizing society, and making any sort of bipartisan consensus or unity completely impossible.
And finally, Section 5, the verdict of history. This brings us right back to our central mystery. If they know they can't win, what is the actual point? Well, the editorial explains that the vote itself isn't the goal, the process is. By initiating the impeachment, the opposition forces these mandatory procedural steps. They have to hold statutory public hearings, conduct full chamber reviews, and critically, they get to enter their version of the facts right into the permanent official record. They essentially want these accusations written in the black and white ink of parliamentary history. The author concludes that this whole event is fundamentally not about winning a vote. Instead, it's about, quote, leaving a crucial constitutional footnote for Taiwan's democracy. The opposition is using the impeachment mechanism as a permanent historical marker. They want to force the administration to face the verdict of history, arguing that those in power can never truly avoid historical scrutiny. So we're going to leave you with this provocative question to ponder. Based on the arguments presented in this editorial, does this strategy of a doomed impeachment truly safeguard constitutional values and democratic records? Or does launching an unwinnable, highly partisan attack just deepen the existing political divides and add more fuel to the fire? It's a really complex issue of political strategy versus historical accountability, and it's perfectly captured in this source material. Thanks for joining us for this explainer today, and as always, keep questioning what's behind the headlines.